She buried her husband on a Tuesday. By Friday, her own son looked her in the eye and laughed. 64 years old, 41 years of marriage. And in the end, all Vivian Cole walked away with was a broken-down farmhouse and the sound of her son's voice telling her she never mattered anyway. But Leonard Cole was not a careless man. He was a patient one. And somewhere inside that crumbling farmhouse, he had left his wife something far more dangerous than money. He had left her the truth. If this story pulls at something inside you, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this one travels. The morning they read Leonard's will, I wore the same black dress I'd worn to his funeral 3 days before. I hadn't washed it. I told myself I hadn't had time, but that wasn't the truth. The truth was, I couldn't bring myself to put it in the washing machine, because washing it meant the week was over, and the week being over meant accepting that Leonard was actually gone, that the man I had loved since I was 22 years old, the man who used to hum off-key in the kitchen every Sunday morning and always burned the toast and never once apologized for it, was in the ground now, and he wasn't coming back. So I wore the unwashed dress, and I drove myself to Hargrove and Reed law offices alone, because there was nobody left to drive me. What? The building was on Clement Street, downtown. One of those old brick buildings that had survived 3 rounds of city renovation simply by being too stubborn to fall down. I sat in my car for 11 minutes before I went inside. I know it was 11 minutes because I watched the clock on my dashboard like it owed me something. I kept thinking about what Leonard had said to me in the hospital. 3 weeks before the end, when the morphine had started blurring the edges of things and his voice had gone thin and papery, he'd reached over and taken my hand and said, "Trust me." Just that. 2 words. I thought he meant trust me, I'm not afraid. Or trust me, everything is going to be okay. That's what dying people say, isn't it? They try to make it easier on the ones being left behind. But sitting in that car looking up at the law office, something cold moved through me. Trust me, what if he meant something else entirely? Meh. I went inside. The receptionist, young woman, very organized, very sorry for my loss, led me down a carpeted hallway to a conference room with a long mahogany table and windows that looked out onto nothing interesting. There was already someone in the room when I arrived. Mason. My son was 40 years old and looked nothing like his father, which had always quietly broken my heart. Leonard was gentle in his features. Soft eyes, slow smile, the kind of face that made strangers feel like they already knew him. Mason had inherited my sharper jaw, my restless energy, but none of the warmth that usually came with it. He was good-looking the way a knife is good-looking. Clean lines, no softness. He was sitting at the head of the table, not to the side, not in the middle, at the head, like the meeting was already his. He didn't stand when I came in. He glanced up from his phone, gave me a nod that somehow managed to feel dismissive and performative at the same time, then looked back down at his screen. "Mom," he said. Not "Hi, Mom." Not "How are you holding up?" Just "Mom," like he was acknowledging a piece of furniture that had managed to walk into the room. His wife Nora was there too, seated to his right, her blonde hair pulled back in something expensive and architectural. She gave me a smile. Tight, practiced, the kind of smile that's really just a face rearranging itself into the shape of politeness. "Vivian," she said, "you look tired." I sat down across from them and folded my hands on the table and said nothing. Daniel Reed came in a few minutes later. He was Leonard's attorney and had been for 20 years, a compact, careful man in his late 50s with silver-framed glasses and the unhurried manner of someone who had sat through enough of these meetings to know that the worst part was never the paperwork. He shook my hand, shook Mason's hand, sat down, and opened his folder. He offered his condolences first. He said Leonard had been a man of uncommon integrity and that he considered it a privilege to have known him. He meant it. I could tell he meant it because his voice changed slightly when he said it, dropped just half a register, the way voices do when grief is personal. Mason shifted in his chair. "We appreciate that," Mason said, in the tone of a man who does not appreciate that and would like to proceed. "But we should probably get started." Daniel looked at him for a moment over his glasses. Then he looked at me. "Of course," he said. He opened the folder. I don't remember every word of what came next. I've replayed it enough times that the edges have gone soft, the way a photograph goes if you handle it too much. But the shape of it, the shape I remember perfectly. Leonard's estate was considerable. 41 years of work, of building, of making something from almost nothing. Coal Industries had started as a regional supply company and grown, under Leonard's quiet and relentless attention, into something worth significantly more than anyone outside the family fully understood. Leonard had never been a man who talked about money. He thought it was vulgar. He thought the people who talked about it most were usually the people who understood it least. The company, its assets, its shares, its subsidiary holdings, its operational control, passed in full to Mason Cole. I heard Nora exhale. I heard Mason say something low and satisfied under his breath. I kept my eyes on Daniel's face because Daniel's face was still very careful, and careful faces usually mean there's more coming. There was more coming. To me, to Vivian Cole, wife of 41 years, the woman who had held Leonard's hand while he learned to be a father, who had sat with him through 3 business failures before the 4th one finally held, who had folded herself smaller and smaller so his life could have more room. To me, Leonard left the farmhouse. Just the farmhouse. The old property out on Route 9, 40 minutes outside the city. The one we'd bought when Mason was small and had mostly stopped using once he left for college. The one with the drafty windows and the kitchen that flooded every spring and the oak tree in the backyard that Leonard used to say was older than everyone's problems combined. Just the farmhouse. The silence after Daniel said it was very long. Check. Mason broke it. He laughed. Not a big laugh. Not a cruel cartoon of a laugh. Something quieter and almost worse. A short, controlled sound that said I knew it. And of course, and this is exactly right, all at once. Well, he said. He sat back in his chair and looked at me with something that wasn't quite pity and wasn't quite contempt, but lived in the neighborhood of both. At least you'll have somewhere to go, Mason. Nora put a hand on his arm. Not to stop him, to steady him, the way you steady something expensive that you're afraid might tip over. I'm just saying. He spread his hands, open, reasonable. The gesture of a man who has decided his cruelty is actually logic. It makes sense. I built a life. I have responsibilities, a business, employees, a family. Mom, and here he paused, tilted his head, chose his next words with the care of someone who wants the wound to be clean. Mom dedicated herself to being a wife. And that's a choice. That's a valid choice. But it's not the same as building something. I looked at my son. I had been in labor with him for 19 hours. I had taught him to read using a set of flashcards spread out on the kitchen floor of our first apartment. I had driven him to baseball practice every Saturday for 6 years, and when he quit at 14 to focus on debate club, I had rearranged my entire schedule without complaint. I had sat up 3 different nights with him during his first year of college when he called me crying, and I hadn't told anyone. Not Leonard, not my sister, not a single soul. Because he'd asked me not to. Because he'd said, Mom, please just don't tell anyone. I'm so embarrassed. And I had kept that secret like a stone in my chest for 22 years. And now he was explaining to me in a conference room, with his wife watching, that what I had done with my life was not the same as building something. I didn't cry. I want you to understand that. I did not cry. I looked at my son, and I felt something in me go very quiet, not empty, not numb, just still. The way water goes still right before it freezes. Are you finished? I asked. He blinked. He hadn't expected that. He'd expected tears, probably, or protests, or the kind of wounded maternal silence that he could later dismiss as dramatic. Mom, are you finished? I said again. He shut his mouth. I turned to Daniel. Is there anything else? But there was. Daniel Reed cleared his throat, a small, deliberate sound, and reached into his folder again. He produced a sealed envelope and a single page with Leonard's handwriting on it, and he slid them across the table toward me. Leonard left specific instructions, Daniel said. There's a letter, addressed to you personally, Vivian, that he asked not be opened here. He was very clear about that. He paused. He asked that it be opened at the farmhouse. Mason frowned. What? Why? He didn't explain why, Daniel said, in the pleasant tone of a man who absolutely knows why. and has been professionally sworn to silence. He simply asked that Vivian open it there, and not before. There's a letter? Nora leaned forward. What does it say? I don't know, Daniel said. It's sealed. Can she just open it here? Is there a legal reason she can't just... It's a letter, I said. I picked up the envelope and put it in my purse. Not a subpoena. Mason stared at my purse. Something moved behind his eyes, a flicker of something I hadn't seen there in years. Not quite concern, not quite curiosity. Something that looked briefly and uncomfortably like fear. Dad always had to make things complicated, he said, but his voice had changed slightly. The confidence had gone just slightly softer at the edges. I stood up, gathered my coat, and extended my hand to Daniel Reed. Thank you, I said, for everything. Leonard was lucky to have you. Daniel shook my hand and held it a moment longer than necessary. He spoke about you often, Vivian. He was very proud of you. I nodded. I did not look at Mason. I walked out. I sat in my car for a long time before I started the engine. The envelope was in my purse, and I could feel the weight of it, which was ridiculous because it weighed almost nothing. It was paper and ink and a dead man's handwriting, but it pressed against my hip like something much heavier. Trust me. I started the car. On the drive home, I went through the stages of it, the way you do when something terrible has been confirmed after a long time of suspecting it. First, there was the numbness, that useful blankness that keeps you functional when you most need to be. I stopped at a red light and watched a woman walk a dog and thought, that's a golden retriever. That's a nice dog, and felt nothing. Then came the grief. Not new grief. Not for Leonard, though that was always there now, layered underneath everything like a second floor. But old grief. For the version of Mason I had believed in longer than the evidence supported. There is a particular heartbreak that belongs only to parents, that comes from the moment you finally stop making excuses and see your child clearly, and what you see is disappointing and frightening and yours. You made this person. You loved this person through everything, and somehow it wasn't enough, or it was wrong, or he was already something you didn't fully understand, forming inside his own private logic, becoming someone who could sit in a conference room and explain to his mother why her life was worth less. I drove and I grieved for that, for the gap between who I'd tried to raise and who had shown up today. Then, underneath the grief, something else, something quieter. He left you the farmhouse, Vivian. He left you the farmhouse and a letter and told you to go there. Leonard was not a careless man. He was not sentimental without purpose. The farmhouse wasn't just a property. It was the place where we had been most ourselves, before money complicated things, before Mason grew up and got sharp, before the world got loud. Leonard had loved that house. He talked about restoring it every year for the last decade, talked about it in the specific way people talk about things they're actually planning to do, rather than just dreaming about. Trust me. I merged onto the highway and made a decision. I would go to the farmhouse tonight. I stopped at my apartment first, changed out of the black dress, finally washed it and left it in the machine, put on something comfortable, jeans and a sweater that had been Leonard's, soft gray with a small moth hole near the left cuff that I had never mended because I couldn't bring myself to. I made a cup of tea I didn't drink. I called my sister Ruth, who lives in Portland and had not been able to come for the funeral because of her hip, and I told her about the will. Not about the letter, just the will. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, in her very Ruth way, "That son of yours has always been a selfish little..." "Ruth, I'm just saying what I'm thinking." "I know you are. That's the problem." He laughed? He actually laughed? I didn't answer. She took that as confirmation. "Vivian," her voice softened, "what are you going to do?" "I'm going to the farmhouse," I said. "Tonight? By yourself?" Viv, it's been empty for what, 8 years? Is the heat even on?" "I'll figure it out." "You'll freeze to death in that drafty old..." "Leonard left me a letter," I said. "He asked me to open it there." Silence on the line. Ruth knew Leonard almost as well as I did. She understood what it meant that he had asked for something specific. She understood that Leonard Cole did not make requests without purpose. "Okay," she said more quietly. "Okay. You call me when you get there. I will. And Vivian? Yes. Whatever's in that letter, it's from him, not from whatever today was. Whatever today was, that was from Mason. The letter's from Leonard. I held the phone to my ear for a moment after she finished speaking. I know, I said. I know. The drive to Route 9 takes 40 minutes in good traffic. It was nearly 7 in the evening by the time I got there, and the last of the light had turned that specific winter orange that always made me feel like the sky was trying to apologize for something. The farmhouse sat back from the road down a long gravel driveway lined with old maple trees that had lost their leaves weeks ago. Their branches were bare against the orange sky, and for a moment, pulling into the drive, I had the strange feeling of driving back in time, of being 30 years old again, with a boy in the back seat who was asleep with his cheek against the window, and Leonard driving, humming something tuneless and pleased. The house was dark. Of course it was dark. It had been dark for 8 years, given life only occasionally by a caretaker Leonard had paid to keep the worst of the neglect at bay. The porch sagged in one corner. Paint peeled from the window frames. The garden that I had once spent every September tending was overgrown and shapeless, years of neglect having turned it from something cultivated into something feral. But the bones were good. Leonard always said that. The bones are good, Vivi. Good bones outlast everything. I got out of the car. The air was cold and smelled of frozen earth and dry leaves, and somewhere in the dark beyond the old barn something rustled. Probably just the wind, probably an animal, but for a moment my heart rate spiked before settling. I went to the front door. The key I had, the one from the small hook inside my apartment where it had hung, unused for years, still worked. The lock was stiff and protested, but it turned. The door swung inward with the particular creak of a house that has been waiting. I found the light switch. A lamp came on in the hallway, so the electricity was still connected at least. The light was warm and a little unsteady, an old bulb, and it lit up a hallway that was thick with dust and memory. Leonard's boots were still by the door. Old brown work boots, the ones he'd worn every time we came out here. He'd left them there, probably a decade ago, and nobody had moved them. They sat on the mat exactly where he'd left them, cracked and dried and completely themselves. I stood there for a long time, just looking at those boots. Then I sat down on the hallway floor, in my good jeans and Leonard's gray sweater, and I did something I hadn't done since the hospital. I cried. Gee. I don't know how long I sat there. Long enough for the floor to be cold through my jeans, long enough for the worst of it to pass, which it does. Grief always does. It never goes away, but it does pass through, like a weather system, and afterward the air is different. I stood up, dusted off my knees, went to the kitchen, ran the tap until the water ran clear, splashed some on my face. Okay, I told myself. Okay. I took the envelope from my purse. Leonard's handwriting on the front. Vivian. In the slightly formal, slightly cramped way he always wrote my name. He'd always said he wrote my name carefully because it deserved to be written carefully, which was the kind of thing Leonard said that I used to dismiss as sentimental and now understood had been keeping me afloat my entire adult life. I sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Mason had eaten cereal on Saturday mornings, where Leonard and I had argued once, badly, about money. The only time we'd ever really argued about money, and then made up quietly, without drama, the way two people who are committed to each other learn to do. I opened the envelope. Inside was a single folded letter and taped to the inside flap of the envelope, a key, small, gold-colored, old by the look of it. I set the key on the table and unfolded the letter. Leonard's handwriting, 3 pages. I read slowly. My Vivian. If you're reading this, then the day has come that I've been preparing for longer than you know, and I'm sorry. I'm sorry that I had to keep so much from you, and I'm sorry that what I'm about to tell you is going to be a shock. But I need you to read every word before you do anything else. Promise me that, Vivi. Read every word. I've spent the last 8 months watching our son. I know you've done the same with that particular patience you have that I have never fully deserved and always been grateful for. You see Mason more clearly than I do, I think, because you love him in a more complicated way. I loved him the way fathers love sons, which has a certain blindness built into it. You loved him the way mothers love sons, which is eyes open even when you'd give anything to close them. The company is not what Mason thinks it is. What he inherited today is a shell. A very convincing shell, documented correctly, announced properly, but a shell. Over the last 14 months, I have worked quietly with Daniel Reed to restructure coal industries. The real assets, the investments, the property holdings, the cash reserves, the trusts, have been moved. Legally, carefully, completely. What remains is a company that looks healthy and is not. The debts are real. The contracts Mason will discover are real in their terms, but catastrophic in their obligations. I have said nothing because I needed him to walk into this believing it was real. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking I did this out of anger, out of punishment. I didn't. I did it because I love him. And I watched our son for years, Vivian, for years, become someone I didn't recognize. Someone who believed that wealth was a virtue. Someone who treated people with less as if less was what they deserved. I watched him with you. I watched how he spoke to you when he thought I wasn't paying attention. I heard things I was never meant to hear, and I made a decision. A man who has always had everything will never understand the value of anything. He needs to lose it. He needs to lose it completely and absolutely and without cushion, and he needs to rebuild from nothing because that is the only thing that will save him from the person he's becoming. Now. The gold key. Go to the study. You know the one? The small room off the back hallway. The one I always kept locked. The one you asked about twice and I told you was just storage. I'm sorry I lied to you about that. I'm sorry about a lot of small lies I told in service of this, and I hope you'll forgive me. There's a panel in the east wall, 3 feet from the window behind the bookcase. Push on the lower left corner. What you find behind it belongs to you. All of it. Every document has your name on it. Daniel has copies of everything. It is entirely legal, entirely yours, and has been for 6 months. I didn't tell you sooner because I needed you to walk into that office today without knowledge, without performance. I needed your reaction to be real. I'm sorry for that too. The number is larger than you're expecting. Don't panic. And Vivian, don't be too hard on Mason when it comes to this. What I'm doing to him isn't cruelty. It's the most serious love I know how to give. It's the only kind that might actually work on the man he's become. You were never the lesser inheritance. You were never the consolation prize. You were always the point. I love you. I have loved you since I was 24 years old, and you came into my parents' kitchen wearing a green coat. And you were arguing with someone on the telephone, and you didn't even notice me standing there. And I thought, well, there she is. There she is. Trust me. Leonard. I read the letter 3 times. Then I sat very still at the kitchen table in the old farmhouse with dust on every surface, and Leonard's boots by the front door, and a small gold key on the table in front of me. My heart was beating very fast. My hands were not quite steady. The study was down the back hallway, past the bathroom with the cracked tile, past the linen closet that always stuck. I had walked past it 10,000 times. I had asked about it twice, and accepted his answers and moved on, because that was the kind of trust we had built. The kind where you didn't require explanation for every locked door. I picked up the key. I stood up. I walked down the back hallway, and every step felt strange. Not unreal, but hyper-real, the way certain moments are. When you understand that the ground you're standing on is about to shift and you're walking toward it anyway. The study door opened with the gold key. Inside was a small room that smelled of old paper and cedar, lined with shelves and filing cabinets. A single window, a lamp on a wooden desk. And in the east wall, exactly where Leonard had said, a bookcase. I moved the bookcase. It was lighter than expected, built to move, designed to move, and there was the panel. I pressed the lower left corner. It opened. Behind it was a safe built into the wall, heavy and old and real. And the same key that had opened the study door opened the safe. Just up. What was inside? I'm going to try to describe what I saw, but I want you to understand that description doesn't fully cover it. Numbers don't fully cover it. What I felt standing there wasn't just shock. It was something much more complicated. Grief and love, and the particular vertigo of realizing that the man you loved had been, in his quiet and methodical way, thinking about you and protecting you and building something for you even while he was dying. Even while you sat beside him in the hospital and held his hand and thought you were the one holding him up. He was holding me up. He was always holding me up. The safe contained a bound portfolio of investment accounts with her name as sole beneficiary. Property deeds for 7 separate parcels, including the farmhouse, including 2 commercial properties in the city, including a parcel of land in the valley that she had not known he owned. A sealed legal document packet with a letter from Daniel Reed confirming that everything within had been legally transferred to Vivian Ann Cole 6 months prior, fully notarized, fully recorded, cash. A moderate amount, enough to be useful, not enough to be frightening. And at the bottom, a smaller envelope on which Leonard had written simply, the number. Inside that envelope was a single piece of paper. The number on that paper had 9 digits. $93,240,000. I put the paper down on the desk. I walked to the window and looked out at the dark yard, at the bare maple trees, at the sky that had gone fully dark now and was thick with stars. Don't panic, he had written. I almost laughed. The sound that came out of me wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite a sob, but was somewhere in between. That particular human sound that has no proper name, that only comes out in moments like this one. I pressed my forehead against the cold glass of the window. You impossible man, I whispered. The stars didn't answer. The house held its breath. Outside, an owl somewhere called once and then went quiet. I stood there for a long time, my forehead against the cold glass, Leonard's sweater around my shoulders, and I let everything in. The grief and the love and the shock and the strange, terrifying, expanding feeling of being, for the first time in a very long time, the person at the center of the story instead of the person at the edges. Leonard had seen me. All those years, all those ordinary days, he had seen me, and he had planned quietly and methodically to make sure that when it mattered, when it really mattered, I would not be left with nothing. He had left me everything. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the old kitchen with the letter and the papers and a cup of tea that I actually drank this time, and I read everything twice. And I called Ruth at midnight, even though I knew she'd be asleep, and when she picked up and said, "Vivian, what in the world? It's midnight," I said, "Leonard left me $93 million in a safe behind a bookcase in the farmhouse." There was a very long silence on the line. "Say that again," Ruth said. I said it again. Another silence. "I'm going to need you," Ruth said slowly, "to say that one more time, because I'm old and my hearing isn't what it was." Ruth, 93 million, and some change. Vivian, some change. I started laughing, genuinely laughing, the kind that comes when everything has been too much for too long and something finally cracks it open, and Ruth started laughing too, and we laughed until we were both crying a little, and then we just breathed at each other across the phone line for a while, 2 old women, 2 sisters, 3 in the morning in different time zones holding on. "He loved you," Ruth said finally, quietly. "He loved you so much." "I know," I said. I looked at Leonard's boots by the door. "I know." I stayed at the farmhouse that night. The heat still worked, barely, the old boiler complaining through the pipes, and I found blankets in the linen closet, the same ones we'd used when Mason was small. I made up the bed in the main bedroom, the one with the window that looked out over the oak tree that was older than everyone's problems combined. Before I slept, I sat on the edge of the bed and held Leonard's letter in both hands. I read the last lines one more time. "You were always the point." "Okay, Leonard," I said, "to the room, to the house, to whatever remained of a man in the things he had touched and loved and left carefully behind. Okay, I trust you." I turned off the light. Outside, the oak tree stood in the dark, patient and enormous, its bare branches completely still. In the days that followed, Mason Cole began to celebrate his inheritance. He didn't know yet what he'd actually inherited. He would find out soon. I spent 3 days at the farmhouse before I went back to the city. 3 days of going through Leonard's papers, of calling Daniel Reed with questions, of walking through every room with a notepad and trying to understand the full scope of what my husband had built in secret while the rest of us weren't looking. Daniel was patient with me. He had clearly been waiting for this, waiting for the moment I would call and he could finally speak plainly, without the careful, measured language of a man keeping someone else's secret. He started restructuring 14 months ago, Daniel told me on the second morning, his voice steady and professional over the phone. When the diagnosis came back serious, he didn't tell you because I would have argued with him, I said. A pause. Yes, that was his concern. He would have been right. I would have argued with him. He knew that too. I sat down on the old porch steps with the notepad on my knees and looked out at the overgrown garden. The frost had settled overnight on what was left of the dead grass, and in the morning light it looked almost intentional, like something decorative, like someone had tried to make something beautiful out of the end of things. Daniel, I said, when Mason figures out what the company actually is, how long does he have before it becomes visible? Daniel was quiet for a moment, the careful kind of quiet. Leonard estimated 6 to 8 weeks before the first obligations come due that can't be met without the reserves that are no longer there. After that, he paused. It will move quickly. 6 to 8 weeks. I wrote that down on the notepad, circled it, then sat staring at it for a long time. He's going to be devastated, I said. Yes, and angry, almost certainly. At Leonard, at me. Vivian. Daniel's voice shifted, gentled slightly. Leonard was very clear in his instructions about one thing. He said, and I'm reading directly from his notes here, Vivian is not to feel guilty about this. She didn't do it. I did. If Mason needs someone to be angry at, he can be angry at me. I can take it. I pressed my lips together. That was Leonard, all right. That was so completely, entirely Leonard that it almost knocked the air out of me. That even from beyond whatever came after, he was still trying to take the weight off my shoulders. Okay, I said. Okay. I went back inside and kept reading. By the third day, I had a clear picture of what Leonard had built for me, and it was larger and more deliberate than even the letter had prepared me for. The $93 million wasn't one lump sum sitting in one account. It was structured, diversified, layered across investments and properties and trusts in a way that made it almost impossible to attack legally and very easy to live from quietly. Leonard had thought of everything: tax implications, liquid access, long-term management. He had spent 14 months of his dying building me a fortress, and he had done it while sitting across from me at dinner and asking how my day was and never once letting it show on his face. I didn't know whether to be grateful or furious or devastated by that. I settled, eventually, on all three at once. On the third evening, I locked the safe, replaced the panel, moved the bookcase back, and turned off all the lights. I stood in the hallway one last time by Leonard's boots, and I said the thing I'd been putting off saying since the first night. I'm going to take care of it, I told the empty house. I don't know how yet, but I'm going to take care of it. The house didn't answer, but it felt, in the particular way that old houses can feel, like something had been acknowledged. I drove back to the city in the dark. The call from Mason came 9 days later. I was in my apartment kitchen making soup, actual soup, from scratch, the kind Leonard used to request in winter, when my phone buzzed on the counter and his name appeared on the screen. I looked at it for a moment. 3 rings, 4. I picked up. Mom. His voice was different, not the conference room voice, controlled and deliberate. This was something raw, though he was clearly working to keep it contained. I need to ask you something. Hello, Mason. Did you know? He said. Just like that. No preamble, no softening. About the company. Did you know what Dad did? I put the wooden spoon down against the side of the pot. What makes you think your father did something? Because I have been going through the financial records for a week, Mason said, and now I could hear it, the strain underneath the controlled voice, a thread being pulled too tight. And what I'm finding, Mom, what I'm finding doesn't make sense. There are debt obligations I didn't know existed. There are contracts with terms that are... I had 3 of my lawyers look at them, and they all said the same thing. These are designed to fail. These contracts are designed to fail. Mason, did you know? His voice cracked just slightly. He caught it, recovered, pushed it back down. Because I need to understand if this is... I need to know if my father deliberately... I think, I said carefully, that you should talk to Daniel Reed. Silence on the line. Daniel Reed, he repeated. He was your father's attorney for 20 years. If there are questions about the structure of the company, Daniel would be the right person. Mom? Now there was something sharper in his voice, something that lived right at the border of accusation. Mom, do you know what's in that company? Do you know what I actually inherited? I looked at my soup, the steam rising from it, slow and steady. Call Daniel, Mason, I said. I mean it. I hung up. My hands were not completely steady when I set the phone back on the counter, but they were steadier than I would have expected. I picked up the wooden spoon and stirred the soup and breathed through it, and thought about Leonard at 14 months out from his diagnosis, sitting in a room with his attorney and quietly, methodically, building a trap for his son that was also, somehow, the most extravagant act of love I had ever witnessed. The soup was good. I ate it alone at the kitchen table, looking out the window at the winter street, and I thought, this is what the next part of my life feels like. Alone. Quiet. Eating soup I made myself in an apartment that has my name on the lease and watching a city go by outside and knowing, for the first time in a long time, that I am not dependent on anyone's mercy. It wasn't joy. Not yet. But it was something important. Something I hadn't had in years. It was safety. 2 weeks after that call, Nora showed up at my door. I wasn't expecting her. It was a Tuesday morning, 10:15, and I had been in the middle of a phone call with a property manager Daniel had recommended. I heard the knock, thought it was the building's maintenance man who'd been coming to fix a radiator, and opened the door in my housecoat and reading glasses. Nora stood in my hallway in a camel coat that had not been cheap, her hair done perfectly, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the good place 3 blocks away. She looked composed the way a person looks composed when they have been practicing composure since early morning. I should have called, she said. Yes, I agreed. We looked at each other for a moment. I brought coffee, she said. I can see that. Another moment. Can I come in? She asked. I wasn't sure I wanted her to. Nora and I had never been close. She'd married Mason when he was 32 and she was 29, and she'd always treated me with the particular brand of politeness that's really a form of distance, careful and consistent and impossible to argue with. She wasn't cruel the way Mason was sometimes cruel. She was just absent. I had never been sure whether she was absent because she didn't care or because she'd learned it from Mason the way you learn everything from the person you live with. But she'd brought the good coffee, and she'd come alone. I stepped back and let her in. We sat at the kitchen table, and Nora wrapped both hands around her cup and looked at me in a way she'd never looked at me before. Direct, without the performance. He's falling apart, she said. I said nothing. Lawyers found another set of obligations last week. And the investors, there were 3 calls yesterday. Mason was on the phone until midnight, and when he came to bed, he just... She stopped. Something moved across her face. He didn't sleep. He just lay there, staring at the ceiling. Nora, I'm not here to ask you to fix it, she said quickly. I'm not here to ask you for money. I want you to know that. She paused. Mason doesn't know I'm here. He wouldn't like it. Why are you here then? She looked down at her coffee. The composure shifted slightly, a small crack, like ice beginning to give. Because I don't know what's real anymore. About Mason, about what we built together, about whether any of it was actually solid or whether I've been living in a story someone made up. She looked up. Did you know? About the company? I studied her face. Nora, at 40 years old, was a more complicated person than Nora at 29 had appeared to be. There was something genuinely frightened in her eyes, and also something genuine, period, so some real quality that I hadn't known was there because she'd kept it locked away, maybe even from herself. Your father-in-law, I said carefully, was a very deliberate man. So you did know. I found out after he died. She nodded slowly, processing that. Was it punishment? For Mason? I thought about Leonard's letter. This is not punishment. This is the most serious love I know how to give. No, I said. It wasn't punishment. Nora looked unconvinced. It feels like punishment. I know. I turned my coffee cup in my hands. Nora, can I ask you something honest? Okay. Did you think what Mason said to me in that conference room was acceptable? The question landed clean and flat between us. Nora didn't flinch from it, which surprised me. She held still, and the thing moved across her face again. Not guilt exactly, but something adjacent to it, recognition, discomfort. No, she said. I didn't. Did you say so? A pause. No. Why not? She looked down at the table. For a moment she was quiet, and I let her be quiet, because I've learned over 64 years that the silence people fill with honesty is worth waiting for. Finally she said, because I chose him. And when you choose someone, you convince yourself that the parts of them you don't like are smaller than they are, or that they'll change, or... She stopped, started again. I thought it would pass. His attitude toward you. I thought it was a phase, or stress, or grief about Leonard being sick. I kept thinking it would pass. How long have you been thinking that? She didn't answer, but the look on her face answered for her. A long time. She'd been thinking it would pass for a long time. I reached across the table and put my hand briefly over hers. She looked startled, genuinely startled, like she hadn't expected the gesture and didn't know what to do with it. Go home, I said. Take care of yourself. What happens with the company is going to happen, and it isn't something you or I can prevent. But you need to think very clearly about what you want your life to look like. Not Mason's life. Yours. She looked at me for a moment, something in her face that I couldn't quite read. Then she nodded, stood up, buttoned her coat. He's not all bad, she said at the door. Half statement, half question. I know he's not, I said. He's my son. I know every version of him, including the versions he doesn't know himself. I paused. That's not the same as saying what he is right now is okay. She left. I closed the door and stood in the hallway for a moment. Then I went back to the kitchen, poured the rest of my coffee down the sink because it had gone cold, and called Daniel Reed. It's starting, I told him. Yes, he said. The first default notice goes out Friday. How bad? Bad enough. He paused. Are you all right, Vivian? I thought about it. Really thought about it. Standing in my kitchen in my housecoat and reading glasses, 64 years old, a dead husband's secret in my chest, and a fortune in an old farmhouse safe, and a son who was currently watching everything he thought he'd built begin to crack apart at the foundations. I'm all right, I said. And then, because it was Daniel, and Daniel had known Leonard and knew me and deserved the real answer. I'm scared of what comes next, not for myself, for Mason. Leonard thought this through, Daniel said quietly. I know he did. I looked out the window. That doesn't make it easy to watch. No, Daniel agreed. It doesn't. What happened to Mason over the next 6 weeks was not quiet. I watched from a distance, the way you watch a fire from across the street, close enough to see clearly, far enough that the heat doesn't reach you, or you tell yourself it doesn't reach you. That's not entirely true. The first public signs came in the business press. Small items, the kind that appear in the back pages of financial sections, the kind most people skim past. Questions about coal industry's debt structure, a postponed contract announcement, an investor who had quietly withdrawn from a meeting without explanation. Individually, these things meant nothing. Together, they meant everything to anyone who knew how to read them. Mason knew how to read them. He'd spent his career knowing how to read them, and so he watched his own collapse announced in the language he'd built his identity around. And there was a particular cruelty in that, not Leonard's intended cruelty, but the accidental cruelty of the universe, which occasionally has a sense of irony. Nora called me twice during those weeks, not to ask for anything, just to talk, which surprised me both times. The second time she called, she told me that Mason had begun having panic attacks at night, which he refused to call panic attacks and instead described as chest tightness from stress, which is what men of Mason's generation call panic attacks when they cannot bring themselves to name the real thing. He won't see anyone, Nora said. A doctor, a therapist, anyone. He says he's fine. He's not fine, I said. I know. Nora. I paused. Are you fine? A silence. I don't know yet, she said. I'm trying to figure out what fine looks like from here. The third week, I saw Mason's face on a news site, not a major outlet, a regional business blog, the kind with aggressive headlines and just enough sourcing to not be sued. The headline said something about leadership questions at coal industries following the founder's death, and Mason's photo was beside it, a headshot from some conference years ago where he'd been young and sharply confident and clearly certain that the future was already his. He looked in that photo like someone who had never imagined losing. I closed the laptop. I went to the farmhouse that weekend and worked. Not on the papers. I'd done the papers. I cleaned, I scrubbed floors and wiped down shelves and replaced a broken window latch and dragged years of neglect out of corners that hadn't seen attention in a decade. It wasn't efficient grief. It wasn't even intentional. It was just the only way I knew to be in a body that needed to do something when everything important was out of its hands. By Sunday afternoon, I'd had the kitchen looking almost like itself again. I made tea and stood at the window and looked at the oak tree in the yard. And I thought about Leonard walking out to that tree when Mason was 7 years old, lifting the boy up into the lower branches, telling him something I couldn't hear from the kitchen window, but that had made Mason laugh. Genuinely laugh. The real kind. The kind that doesn't perform itself. Mason used to laugh like that. I hadn't heard that laugh in 15 years. I wondered if Leonard's plan would bring it back. I wondered if any plan could. I wondered if the version of my son I was mourning, the 7-year-old in the oak tree, was someone he could ever find his way back to, or whether that person was simply gone, grown over by everything that had come after. I didn't know. That not knowing sat in me heavy and persistent, the way not knowings do when they involve your children. There is no category of uncertainty that weighs more. Parents carry it for years. That particular suspended question, who will my child become? And did I have anything to do with it? And can I do anything now? And is it already too late? And the not knowing doesn't get easier with time. It just becomes more familiar. You learn to breathe around it. I breathed around it. And then I went back inside and picked up the mop and kept cleaning. But it was a Thursday evening, 5.5 weeks after the will reading, when everything broke open in a way I hadn't expected. I was at my apartment. It was past 9. I had eaten dinner, read for an hour, was considering bed. My phone buzzed. Not a call, a text, from a number I recognized as Nora's. 3 words. He just left. I stared at the text for a moment, then I called her. She picked up on the first ring, and I could hear immediately that she had been crying. Not currently crying, but recently. The kind of voice that has been wrung out and left to dry. He packed a bag, she said. Not everything. A bag. He said he needed to think. He said... She stopped, gathered herself. He said he couldn't be in the house right now because everything in it reminded him of what he'd failed at. Do you know where he went? No. He wouldn't say. Another pause. Vivian, I don't know what I'm supposed to do right now. You're not supposed to do anything right now, I said firmly. You're supposed to let him go be somewhere and be responsible for himself for a night, and you're supposed to take care of yourself. What if he'll be all right, I said, and I said it with the particular conviction of a woman who has been a mother for 40 years and understands that sometimes the most important thing you can do is sound certain even when you aren't, because the person on the other end needs the steadiness more than they need the truth. After I hung up, I sat very still in my armchair for a long time. Then I did something I hadn't planned to do. I got up, put on my coat, and drove to Mason's old apartment building across town. The one he'd lived in during his 20s, before Nora, before the big house in the Cresthaven neighborhood. The one with the small park across the street where he used to go when things got bad in those years. I parked across from the park and waited. I don't know why I was certain he'd be there. I can't fully explain it. Mothers know certain things without being able to explain the mechanism of knowing. I just knew. 20 minutes later, headlights turned into the small parking area beside the park, and a car I didn't recognize, something modest, a rental maybe, pulled in. Mason got out. He was carrying a bag. He stood in the parking lot for a moment, looking at the park, and even from across the street, in the dark, with distance between us, I could see that the thing holding him upright was barely doing its job. He walked into the park and sat on a bench. I sat in my car and watched my son sit alone in a park in the dark in November, and I thought about Leonard's letter, about transformation, about how love sometimes looks nothing like love while it's happening and only reveals its shape in retrospect. I did not get out of the car. This was not my moment to fix. Leonard had understood that. You cannot reach in and extract the lesson from a person before they've lived it all the way through. The only thing you can do is stay close enough that when they surface, you're there. I stayed for an hour, then I drove home. That night I slept better than I had in weeks. I don't know what that says about me. Maybe it just says that I finally believed, sitting in that car watching my son in that park, that this was really going to happen. That Mason was really going to hit the bottom that Leonard had engineered with so much care, and that hitting the bottom was really, actually, the beginning and not the end. Maybe it just says that Leonard was right. He was usually right. That had always been somewhat annoying. It was not less annoying for his being dead. I pulled the covers up, closed my eyes, and for the first time in weeks, I dreamed of the farmhouse the way it used to be. Full of light, full of noise, the oak tree in summer green outside the kitchen window, and somewhere in the house, Leonard humming something tuneless and off-key, and it not mattering at all. The collapse, when it became fully public, was not graceful. Nothing about it was. I want to be honest about that because there's a version of this story where Mason's fall reads like something cinematic, clean lines, dramatic headlines, a man undone in a single decisive moment. That's not what happened. What happened was messier and slower, and in some ways more painful to witness, the way real things usually are when they fall apart. Not a single crash, a long grinding unraveling, each day pulling another thread, until the whole shape of the thing came loose. The first major headline ran on a Monday. I saw it on my phone before I'd gotten out of bed. A proper financial news outlet this time, not the regional blog. The headline used the word crisis. It used Mason's full name. It had a quote from an unnamed source inside the company describing leadership as reactive and overwhelmed. There was a photograph of the coal industries building downtown, the glass one Leonard had moved into 12 years ago, the one with his name on the directory in the lobby. I put the phone face down on the nightstand and lay there staring at the ceiling. I had known this was coming. I had been told, in precise and careful terms by Daniel Reed, exactly when and how this would become visible. Knowing didn't make it easier. I'm not sure why I expected it might. Preparation and experience have very little effect on that specific dread. The dread of watching someone you love suffer something you could not prevent and chose not to. I got up. I made coffee. I did not read any more news. Ruth called at 8:30. I saw, she said before I could even say hello. I know. How are you? Complicated, I said, which was accurate. Have you talked to him? Not since the phone call 3 weeks ago. He hasn't reached out. Vivian. Ruth's voice had the specific texture it gets when she's about to say something she thinks I need to hear and is bracing for me to push back on it. He's still your son. I know he is, Ruth. I know that every single day. I'm just saying that when this gets bad enough, and it sounds like it's getting there, he might need Ruth. I set my coffee down. Leonard had a plan. I'm trusting the plan. That means I don't step in and cushion things before they've done what they need to do. I paused. That's the hardest thing I've ever made myself do. In case you're wondering, it's harder than the will reading. It's harder than the letter. Just sitting here and not fixing it. A silence. Yeah, Ruth said quietly. Yeah, I believe that. We stayed on the phone a while longer, not talking about Mason, talking about other things. Her hip, the weather, a book she'd been reading. The ordinary conversation of two sisters who have known each other long enough that sometimes just the sound of the other person's breathing is enough. After we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table with my coffee and made myself think clearly about what I was doing and why. It is very easy, when you are watching someone you love suffer, to reframe inaction as strategy. To tell yourself you're following a plan when really you're just afraid to move. I needed to be honest with myself about which one it was. Leonard's plan. I believed in it. I had read that letter 15 times by then, had turned it over in my mind from every angle, and I believed, not blindly, not because he was my husband and I had loved him, but because I knew Leonard Cole better than anyone alive knew him. That he had understood something about Mason that Mason didn't understand about himself. That the collapse was necessary. That there was no version of this story where Mason became a different kind of man without first losing the identity he'd built around the wrong things. But believing in the plan didn't mean it wasn't costing me something. Every morning I woke up and felt the weight of it fresh. My son was somewhere in this city watching his life come apart, and I was sitting at my kitchen table drinking coffee and trusting a dead man's judgment. There is no script for that. There is no comfortable position. You just hold it, and you breathe, and you keep going. Nora called on a Wednesday, 2 weeks after the headlines started. Her voice, when I picked up, had none of the careful composure of our kitchen meeting. She sounded tired in the specific way that comes not from one bad night, but from weeks of them, the kind of tired that lives behind your eyes. "He came back," she said, after that night. "He came back and he's been home, but Vivian, he's not the same." "What do you mean?" "He doesn't go into the office anymore. He sits in the study for hours, and I can hear him on the phone, but I can't hear what he's saying. And then he comes out, and he's just blank, like someone turned something off behind his eyes." She paused. "I've never seen him like this. In 12 years, I have never seen him like this." "Is he eating?" "Sometimes." "Sleeping?" "Not much." She hesitated. "He asked me last night if I thought his father hated him." I closed my eyes. "What did you say?" I asked. "I said no. I said Leonard didn't hate him." Another pause. "But Vivian, do you think he did? Even a little? Do you think Leonard did all of this because somewhere underneath everything he—" "No," I said, firm, no hesitation, because this one I was certain of. Leonard didn't hate Mason. He was frightened of who Mason was becoming. Those are different things. Hatred wants the other person to suffer. What Leonard wanted was for Mason to change, completely different intention. But the result looks the same right now. "The result looks the same right now," I agreed. "And that's the hardest part." Nora was quiet for a moment. Then, "Vivian, I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth." "Okay. Is there money? Somewhere? Is there something that could... Is there a way this doesn't destroy everything?" I sat with that question, not because I didn't know the answer, but because the honest answer was complicated, and Nora deserved the real version, not the clean version. "Mason is going to be all right," I said, finally. "I can't tell you more than that right now, but I want you to hold on to that. He is going to be all right." Nora made a sound, not quite a breath, not quite a word, something in between, the sound of a person grabbing onto the edge of something they're not sure will hold. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay?" After we hung up, I held the phone in both hands for a long moment. Then I called Daniel Reed and asked him to expedite something we had been discussing, a specific piece of what came next, once Mason had fully reached the bottom that Leonard had intended. Daniel asked if I was sure about the timing. "Not yet," I said. "But soon." The lawsuit filing made the news 3 days later. Not one lawsuit. 4, filed within 48 hours of each other by investors who had clearly been coordinating. I read about it the same way I'd been reading everything, with a kind of numb focus, the focus of someone watching an event they cannot alter and have chosen not to try. What I hadn't anticipated was the photograph. One of the outlets had a photographer outside the Coal Industries building that afternoon, apparently there for an unrelated story. Mason walked out of the building at 3 in the afternoon, alone, which was unusual. Mason almost never went anywhere publicly without someone beside him, and the photographer caught him mid-step on the sidewalk. Not posed, not performing, just caught. He looked exhausted. He looked smaller than I remembered him looking. His suit was good, the way his suits were always good, but it hung slightly wrong, the way clothes hang on a body that has lost weight. It wasn't trying to lose. His eyes were down, watching the sidewalk, and his jaw was set in the way that meant he was holding something together through sheer determination. He looked, in that photograph, like a man who was still trying to look like someone who had it under control. And failing, and knowing he was failing, and trying anyway. He looked, I realized with a shock that went all the way through me, like Leonard. Not in his features. Mason still had my jaw, my restlessness. But in the expression, in the set of it. Leonard had looked exactly like that in the last months of his illness, when he was trying to protect me from how frightened he was. That particular brand of dignity that comes not from confidence, but from refusing to let the fear win. Holding the line not because you believe you can hold it indefinitely, but because letting go is not something you know how to do. My son, I thought, had more of his father in him than either of them knew. I saved the photograph to my phone. I'm not sure why. I still have it. He came to my apartment on a Thursday night, 7 weeks after the will reading. I heard the knock at 9:30 and knew before I opened the door. Don't ask me how. The knowing came from the same place the park knowledge had come from, that particular maternal frequency that doesn't require explanation. I opened the door. Mason stood in the hallway of my building looking like a man who had driven across the city 3 times, trying to talk himself out of this and finally given up. His coat was damp. It had started raining an hour ago, and he hadn't bothered with an umbrella. His hair was wet at the edges. He was holding nothing. No bag, no briefcase, nothing. Just himself, which was clearly all he could manage. He looked at me. I looked at him. He opened his mouth and closed it again. Mason, I said, I don't... He stopped. Started again. I didn't know where else to go. I stepped back from the door. Come in, I said. He came in. He stood in my hallway in his wet coat and looked around at my apartment with the slightly unfocused look of someone whose brain is running too many processes at once to land on any of them. I went to the kitchen, put the kettle on, came back with a towel for his hair, which he accepted without comment. Sit down, I said. He sat on my couch. He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and his hands clasped and stared at the floor. For a long moment he said nothing, and I let him say nothing, because I have sat with enough grief and enough shame to know that some things take a minute to find the door out. I had 4 lawyers on a call today, he said, finally, to the floor, and at the end of it, one of them, the one I've used for 11 years, the one I trusted, said that his firm was withdrawing from the case. He said, Mason's voice stalled. He pressed his lips together. He said he didn't think there was a viable path forward. Those words, a viable path forward. He said it like he was reading from a script, like he'd rehearsed saying it to me. I didn't say anything. The company is gone, Mason said. Or it will be, within 60 days. The assets that are left won't cover the obligations, and the investors know it now, and there's nothing. He lifted his eyes from the floor and looked at me. Dad built something for 30 years, and His voice broke, just slightly, just at the edges. He caught it. I walked into it and I thought it was mine. I thought I deserved it because I'd worked hard, because I'd made something of myself, because, Mason, because I was better at it than you. He said it flat. No performance, no management, just the thing itself, out in the air between us. That's what I thought, that I was smarter, more capable, that Dad leaving you the farmhouse was him acknowledging that I was the one who'd actually... He stopped, put his hands over his face for a moment. Mom, I said those things to you. In front of Daniel, in front of Nora, I said those things to your face, and I meant them, and I know, I said. How are you not... He looked at me. His eyes were red. He was not quite crying, but he was close to it in the specific way that men who have been taught not to cry are close to it, balancing on the edge. How are you not furious with me? I looked at my son, 40 years old and wet from the rain and sitting in my apartment at 9:30 with nowhere left to go and nothing left to hide behind. And I thought about the boy in the oak tree. And I thought about Leonard's letter. He needs to rebuild from nothing because that is the only thing that will save him. And I thought about all the years in between, the years I had watched Mason grow harder and more certain and more unreachable. The years I had told myself it was a phase. It would pass. He was stressed. He would come back. He had come back. Not the way I'd imagined. Stripped down, hollowed out, sitting in a wet coat on my couch. But back. Present. Without the armor. I'm his mother, I said. I don't stop being his mother because he was cruel to me. But Mason... I leaned forward slightly. I need you to understand something. What I feel right now, watching you sit there, it's not triumph. I don't feel good about this. I don't feel vindicated. I paused, searching for the honest word. I feel the same thing I've always felt. I feel like I'm watching my son and hoping he's going to be okay. I felt that since you were 7 years old, and it doesn't go away. Ushumwai Marstan. He stared at me. I I treated you badly, he said. For years. Not just in the conference room. For years. Yes. Why did you still... He stopped. Couldn't finish it. Because love isn't conditional on good behavior, I said. I wish it were sometimes. It would make everything simpler, but it's not. It isn't. I held his gaze. That's not the same as saying it was okay. It wasn't. I want you to know that clearly. What you said to me in that office, Mason, the way you've spoken to me, looked at me, dismissed me for years, that was not okay. And I'm not going to pretend it was, even now. Something shifted in his face. I think he'd been expecting me to soften it, the way he'd maybe expected I would soften it his whole life. The way he'd maybe learned that I would soften things, and so pushed further and further, knowing the edge would move. It didn't move this time. You're right, he said, quietly. No argument. You're right. The kettle had boiled. I went to the kitchen and made 2 cups of tea, the plain kind, the practical kind. I brought them back and handed him one and sat in the chair across from him, and we sat like that for a while. Mother and son, in a small apartment, drinking tea in the rain. And the silence wasn't comfortable exactly, but it was real, and real was something we hadn't been in a long time. I think about Dad, Mason said after a while. I keep thinking, in the hospital, those last weeks, I didn't go enough. I told myself I was busy. I told myself he understood. He turned the cup in his hands. Did he? Did he say anything? I thought about Leonard in the hospital, about the things he'd said and the things he'd held back and the plan he'd been building even then, behind the morphine and the thin voice and the hand that held mine. He said he was proud of you, I said, which was true, not the whole truth, not the complicated truth of the letter, but true. Leonard had said it. He said it was hard for him to show you, that he didn't always know how. Mason's jaw tightened. He nodded once. I didn't make it easy, he said. No, I agreed. You didn't. Another silence. What do I do now? He asked. And there was nothing left in the question. No performance, no strategy, no angle. Just a man asking a real question because he genuinely did not know the answer and had run out of pretending that he did. I looked at him for a long moment. You start over, I said. From the bottom, from nothing, and this time you build it the right way. He looked at me like he wasn't sure he believed that was possible, like the concept of starting over at 40, of there being a bottom that was also a starting point, was something his brain was still trying to process. I don't know how to do that, he said. I know, I said. That's okay. You'll learn. He didn't ask me what I meant. Maybe he was too tired. Maybe some part of him that was smarter than the rest sensed there was more coming. Something he wasn't ready to know yet. Something that would require him to be a different version of himself before he could receive it properly. He drank his tea. I drank mine. Outside, the rain kept coming down on the city, steady and impartial, the way rain always is, not cruel, not kind, just present, doing what it does. My son sat on my couch and looked like someone being put back together from the inside. It was the worst he'd ever looked. It was the best I'd seen him in years. He stayed that night on my couch. I didn't offer. He didn't ask. It just happened the way certain things happen between people who are too tired to negotiate. The rain outside got heavier, the hour got later, and at some point Mason's eyes started doing the thing eyes do when a body has been running on fumes for weeks and the fumes have finally run out. I got up without comment, found the extra blanket from the hall closet, the old one, the green one from the farmhouse that I'd brought back without entirely meaning to, and left it on the arm of the couch. He looked at it for a moment, then he looked at me. Mom, get some sleep, I said. I went to bed. I lay in the dark and listened to my apartment settle, to the rain on the windows, to the small sounds of another person in a space that had been only mine for the months since Leonard died. It felt strange. Not bad strange, just present. The house no longer empty in the particular way that grief makes a space feel empty, where every room is a reminder of who isn't in it. I slept. In the morning, Mason was already up when I came out. He'd folded the blanket, not perfectly, but he'd tried, which was something. And he was standing at my kitchen window with a cup of coffee, looking out at the street. His coat was dry. His hair was combed. He'd done what he could with what he had, which I recognized as a form of dignity, small and stubborn. He heard me come in and turned. "I made coffee," he said. "I hope that's okay. I didn't know where everything was, so it took me a while." "It's fine," I said. I poured myself a cup. We stood on opposite sides of the kitchen for a moment, which sounds awkward and was, slightly, but was also honest. We were not a mother and son who had easy mornings together. We were not practiced at ordinary domestic proximity. We were two people who had caused each other real harm and were standing in a kitchen at 7 in the morning trying to figure out what came after that. "I need to tell you something," I said. He looked at me over his coffee cup, alert but not defensive. The defensiveness, I noticed, was largely gone. Whatever had been keeping it in place, pride, certainty, the armor of a man who believed he was winning, had dissolved somewhere in the last 12 hours. "Okay," he said. "Sit down." He sat at the kitchen table. I sat across from him. I had been thinking, in the fragments of consciousness between sleep and waking, about how to do this, about what order the words should come in. Leonard's letter, the farmhouse, the safe, all of it. There was no clean way to tell it. I decided the only way was straight through, so I told him. All of it. From the moment Daniel Reed had slid the sealed envelope across the conference table, to the drive to Route 9, to Leonard's boots by the door, to sitting on the kitchen floor crying, to opening the letter. I told him about the key in the study and the panel in the east wall. I told him about the safe. I told him the number. Mason sat very still throughout. He was good at stillness when he wanted to be. That was something he had gotten from Leonard, that capacity for a controlled quiet that looked like patience even when it was really something more complex. He didn't interrupt. He didn't react visibly. He held his coffee cup in both hands and listened to the whole thing before he said a word. When I finished, the kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the morning traffic had started. Ordinary sounds. A bus going by. Someone's car alarm cycling once and stopping. "He planned it," Mason said. Not a question. "For 14 months. While he was dying." "Yes." Mason set his coffee cup down on the table with a small, careful motion. He looked at his hands. He knew I'd fail. He knew it before I even had the company. He designed it to... He set it up so that I would... He stopped. "He designed it so that you would lose the things that were making you into someone he didn't recognize," I said. "That's different from designing it so you'd fail. He wasn't interested in your failure. He was interested in what came after it." Mason's jaw worked. Something moved through his face. Not one thing, a sequence of things, like weather systems passing, one after another. Anger, I think, was first. Then something that looked like grief. Then something I didn't have a word for. Something that was possibly the specific feeling of understanding, for the first time, the full dimensions of how much someone loved you. "He could have just talked to me," Mason said. "He could have sat me down and..." "He tried," I said quietly. Mason stopped. "Not directly. Not about the money, not about the inheritance, but about who you were becoming. Mason, your father tried to reach you for years. Small conversations that you ended, dinners where you talked over him, phone calls you returned 3 days late. I watched him try." I held my son's gaze. "You weren't available. That's not blame. That's just true." He didn't argue. He looked at the table, and I could see him going back through something in his memory. Sifting. The way you sift when someone says a thing you didn't want to be true, and you check it against what you remember and find out, with a specific sinking feeling that they're right. "He knew I wouldn't listen," Mason said finally. "He knew you'd have to experience it," I said. "He knew the only classroom that would work on you was the real one." Another silence. Then Mason looked up. "Are you angry at him? For not telling you? For keeping all of this from you while he was..." He stopped. "For dying with this plan in his pocket while you sat beside him, not knowing?" I had thought about that. A lot. In the farmhouse, on the drive back, in the weeks since, I had sat with the shape of that specific grievance, that Leonard had spent his last months carrying something enormous, and had chosen to carry it alone, chosen to keep me in the dark, chosen to let me sit beside him in that hospital room holding his hand and believing we had no more secrets. "Yes," I said, "I'm angry about that. Not in a way that changes anything. Yes. I wish he'd told me. I wish he'd trusted me with it while he was still here. I paused. But I also know why he didn't. And knowing why makes it harder to stay angry. Why didn't he? Because I would have tried to protect you from it, I said. And he was right that I would have. I would have argued with him. I would have softened the edges of it. I would have looked at you at that conference table and been unable to let you walk into something that was going to hurt you. Bullshits. What? I looked at my son. Even after what you said to me. Even after the way you looked at me when you laughed. I would have found a way to make it smaller because that's what I've done your whole life. And Leonard knew that. And he loved me enough to make that impossible. Mason stared at me. His eyes were red again, the way they'd been the night before. I don't know how to... He stopped. Put one hand flat on the table, steadying himself against it. Mom, I said you wasted your life. I said it to your face, in front of your husband's lawyer. I said you dedicated yourself to being a wife like it was an insult. His voice had gone rough. And you sat there and you drove to that farmhouse and you didn't call me and yell at me. You didn't... What would yelling have done? I said. Nothing, he admitted. Mom, nothing. But you still deserved to. I deserved a lot of things, I said. Most of them I didn't get. That's life. The question isn't what I deserved. The question is what we do now. He looked at me for a long moment, and I looked back at my son, really looked, the way I hadn't been able to in a long time, because there had always been too much armor in the way, too much performance, too much of the person he was performing at me to see through to the person underneath. He was still there. The person underneath, older, rougher, badly damaged by years of choosing the wrong things, but there, recognizable, mine. I'm sorry, he said, for what I said, for years of all of it. I'm sorry. The words were simple. They weren't eloquent. He didn't dress them up or soften them or surround them with explanation. He just put them on the table between us, plain and unprotected, the way an apology only counts when it's put out there with nothing defending it. I nodded. I know, I said. I believe you. Just like that? Not just like that, I said. It took everything that happened to get to just like that. So no, not just like that. But yes, I believe you. He exhaled. Something in his shoulders dropped slightly that had been held tight for a long time. We sat for a moment in the quiet. Then I said, I'm going to offer you something, and I need you to listen to every part of it before you react, because there are conditions, and the conditions are not negotiable. He straightened slightly. Old habit, the businessman reflex, attention sharpening at the word offer. But it was different now, less calculating, more like the reflex of a man who has been drowning and heard the word rope. Okay, he said. $50,000, I said. A loan, not a gift. A loan with a repayment schedule that Daniel Reed will draw up and that you will sign, and that will be legally binding. I watched his face. Enough to start something small, something real, that you build yourself from the ground up. Not Coal Industries, not anything with that name or that history, something new. Mason said nothing. The conditions, I continued. You work for it. Honest work, consulting, whatever you're actually good at, whatever you can offer that has real value. You live within your means, which are currently modest. You repay your debts, to the investors, to whoever is owed, on whatever schedule is legally possible. And Mason, I paused. Let this part land separately. You go see someone, a therapist, a professional. You go and you keep going, not until you feel better, but until you understand why you became who you became. That's not optional. His jaw tightened at that last part. I'd expected that. Mom, not optional, I said again, evenly. He looked at the table, back at me. The tightness in his jaw was the old Mason, the one who didn't take direction, who didn't accept premises he hadn't chosen himself. I watched him fight with it, visibly, which was the most honest thing I'd seen from him in years. Okay, he said. Okay to which part? All of it, he said. All of the conditions. I studied him. I was not naive. I was 64 years old, and I had lived with a complicated man and raised a more complicated son, And I was not under any illusion that okay meant this would be easy or clean or linear. People do not change the way stories describe changing, in clear movements, one stage at a time, each lesson fully learned before the next begins. Real change is ugly and uneven and full of reversals, and I knew that. But I also knew what I'd seen in my son's face last night, and I knew what I heard in his voice this morning, and I trusted those things more than I trusted my fear. One more thing, I said. He waited. Your father's grave. I want you to go. Not once, regularly. Not because it's what I want, though it is. Because I think you have things to say to him that you haven't said yet, and I think the saying of them matters, even if he can't hear you, maybe especially because he can't hear you. Sometimes we're most honest with people when there's no chance of them responding. Mason looked down at his hands. A long moment. What if I don't know what to say? You'll figure it out, I said. You're his son. You have more of him in you than you know. I called Daniel Reed that morning after Mason left. He accepted, I said. How did he take it? The full story? Hard, I said. The way it should be taken, not dramatically. Hard. I paused. He cried, or almost cried. Mason doesn't quite get there. He stops himself at the edge, but it was the closest I've seen him in 30 years. Leonard would be... Daniel stopped himself. I know, I said. I know he would. I spent the rest of the morning on the phone. There were practical things. The loan paperwork, a conversation with a financial advisor Daniel had recommended, some questions about one of the property deeds from the farmhouse portfolio. Ordinary details of a life that was slowly becoming mine in a way it hadn't been before. Not Leonard's life, not Mason's life in orbit around Leonard's life. Mine. I made decisions I hadn't been asked to make in years. Small ones, mostly. Which accounts to consolidate. Whether to accept a property management proposal, what to do about the farmhouse's heating system before winter got worse. But making them. Being the person at the center of them. The one whose name appeared on the documents. The one whose judgment was the final one. That was new. Or not new. Something retrieved. Something I had been before I handed it over, slowly and without noticing, over the course of a long marriage. I wasn't angry about that either. Leonard and I had built the marriage we'd built together, and there was no clean accounting of who had given what and gotten what and whether the exchange had been fair. Long marriages don't work that way. You can't audit 41 years and come out with a clear ledger. What I knew was that the person he had left behind was more than the person some people had seen when they looked at me. He'd known that. He'd built for that. The rest of it I'd build myself. Says. 2 weeks later, Mason signed the loan documents in Daniel Reed's office. I was there. Mason sat across from Daniel in the same conference room where the will had been read, at the same mahogany table, and he signed every page with a steadiness that I recognized as effort, as something he was choosing, not something that came naturally. His hand was not quite steady. His signature on the last page looked slightly different from the first, slightly looser, like something had given way by the end of it. When he finished, Daniel collected the pages, checked them, nodded. Congratulations, Daniel said with genuine warmth. Starting over is harder than starting. Most people don't do it. Mason looked up at him. You think this will work? Daniel considered the question seriously, which I appreciated. He did not offer the easy answer. I think, he said, that you have the ability to make it work. Whether it works depends entirely on choices you haven't made yet. Mason nodded, sat with that for a moment. Then he looked at me. Thank you, he said. Don't thank me, I said. Earn it. He almost smiled. Not quite. The muscles of his face were not quite ready to go there yet. Not in this room, at this table, but almost. The echo of it. We walked out of the building together and stood on the sidewalk in the cold. The same sidewalk where, weeks ago, a photographer had caught my son looking like a man watching his life come apart. He looked different now. Not better, exactly. Not put together, not confident in the old way. But present. Here, in his body, on this sidewalk, in this version of his life. Not performing a version that no longer existed. I'm going to the cemetery this weekend, he said. Okay, I said. I still don't know what I'm going to say. You have until the weekend, I said. You'll think of something. He nodded, turned up his collar against the cold, started to move. Mason, I said. He stopped. Your father used to say the oak tree in the farmhouse yard was older than everyone's problems combined. I looked at my son. I don't know if that's true, but I think about it when things feel very large. It helps sometimes. He looked at me. Something passed through his face that I couldn't fully name. Something quiet and real and not performed. I remember that tree, he said. I know you do. He walked away down the sidewalk, hands in his coat pockets, heading toward whatever came next. I watched him go until he turned the corner. Then I stood there alone in the cold for a moment, on that ordinary city street, with the sound of traffic and the smell of winter air, and Leonard's voice somewhere in the back of my mind, patient and quiet as it always was. Trust me. I had trusted him. He had been right. I turned and walked the other direction, toward my car, toward the rest of the afternoon, toward the slow and imperfect business of a life being rebuilt from the right materials this time. Not wealth, not status, not the careful management of other people's perceptions. Something older, something that didn't require a number in a safe to confirm. The first snow of the season started falling that evening. Small flakes, tentative, the kind that aren't sure yet if they're committing. I stood at my apartment window and watched them come down on the city, and I thought about the farmhouse, about the oak tree standing in it bare and patient, about spring being further away than it felt, about how much can change in a winter if you let it, about how much had already changed, about how much was still to come. The winter that followed was the longest I could remember in years. Not because it was particularly cold or particularly dark, though it was both of those things. It was long the way winters are long when you are paying attention to them for the first time in a while. When you are not simply enduring the season while waiting for something else to happen, but actually living inside it, day by day, noticing the light changing by small degrees each week, noticing the way the city sounds different when snow is on the ground, noticing yourself. I had not noticed myself in a long time. That sounds like a small thing. It wasn't. There is a specific kind of disappearance that happens to women who spend decades organizing their lives around other people's needs. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't happen dramatically. It's just a slow erosion, one small accommodation at a time, until you look up one day and realize you can't quite remember the last time you made a decision that had nothing to do with anyone else. I had been disappearing for years. Quietly, without drama, without even fully knowing it was happening. That winter, I started coming back. I renovated the farmhouse. Not all at once. It wasn't a movie montage, it was a process, with contractors who showed up late, and materials that came in wrong, and a heating system that required 3 separate visits before anyone identified the actual problem. I made decisions about every room, floors, walls, windows, the kitchen that had flooded every spring for 20 years because nobody had ever fixed the drainage properly. I fixed the drainage. I chose paint colors that I liked, not colors that were safe or neutral or likely to please guests. I put Leonard's boots in the bedroom, on a shelf, because I wanted to see them every morning, not as a shrine, just because they were his and I loved him, and there was no rule that said I had to put that somewhere private. Ruth came to visit in February, her first trip since before the funeral, her hip finally cooperating enough for the flight. She stood in the renovated kitchen with a cup of tea and looked around at what the house had become and said, "Leonard would have loved this." "I know," I said. "You look different," she said. "Different how?" She tilted her head, studying me the way she'd studied me my whole life, with that specific older sister attention that misses nothing and apologizes for nothing. "Like you're standing in the right place," she said. "You look like you're standing in the right place." I thought about that for a long time after she said it. She was right. That was exactly what it felt like. Not happiness, necessarily. Happiness was too simple a word for something this complicated, this weighted with grief and change, and the particular ache of a life being lived differently in its later chapters than it was in its earlier ones. But rightness, a quality of being where I was supposed to be, doing what I was supposed to be doing, in a way I hadn't felt in more years than I could accurately count. Leonard had given me that. Not the money. The money was a tool. What he had given me was the room to stand in the right place. I intended to use it. But Mason called every Sunday. That had started about 6 weeks after the loan signing, without either of us planning it. He called one Sunday afternoon, we talked for 40 minutes, and then the next Sunday he called again, and after 4 or 5 Sundays it had simply become the structure of things. Sunday afternoons, his voice on the phone, telling me about the week. He had started a consulting practice. Small, just himself at first, working out of a rented desk in a shared office space that he described, the first time he mentioned it, with a kind of deliberate flatness, like he was daring himself to say the words without embarrassment. Shared office space. Not a building with his name on the directory. A desk in a room with other people who also had desks. "How is it?" I asked, the first Sunday he mentioned a client. "Weird," he said. "Good weird. I keep waiting for someone to figure out that I used to run a company worth 40 times what this client is paying me and treat me differently, and nobody does. Because nobody here knows. To these people, I'm just a consultant who knows supply chain restructuring." A pause. "It's actually kind of a relief, not being known." "Yes," I said. "I imagine it is." He went to therapy. He didn't talk about it much, and I didn't push. That had been my instinct for weeks, to ask how it was going, to monitor it the way I'd monitored everything involving Mason for 40 years, and I had been very deliberate about resisting that instinct. What he'd said in one of the early Sunday calls was this. "She asks hard questions." My therapist. "I go in thinking I'll have 45 minutes of talking about business stress, and she somehow ends up asking me about when I was 12. And I don't know how she does that, but I come out feeling like I've been turned inside out and wrung dry." He'd paused. "I think it's probably working." "Probably," I'd agreed, careful to keep the relief out of my voice. He went to Leonard's grave. The first time, he told me about it 2 Sundays later, briefly, in the middle of a sentence about something else, like he was trying to slip it past both of us. I went to see Dad last weekend, talked for a while. And then he moved on to whatever he'd been saying before, and I let him move on, and I sat with it privately. The image of my son standing at his father's grave, saying the things he hadn't said while Leonard was alive, and the complicated love that image carried. The second time he went, he told me what he'd said. "I told him I was sorry for not being there more at the end," Mason said, "and I told him I understood, finally, why he did what he did. Not completely. I don't think I'll completely understand it for a long time. But enough." A pause on the line. And then I just sort of talked about what I was working on, about the consulting. I don't know, it felt stupid, but it doesn't sound stupid, I said. "I told him about the shared office space," Mason said, and there was something in his voice that was almost humor, wry and self-aware and new. I figured he'd appreciate the humility of it. I smiled at my kitchen wall. "He would have laughed," I said. "He would have actually laughed. And then he would have told you he was proud of you." A long silence on the line. "Yeah," Mason said. "Yeah, I think so too." He met Claire in March. I heard about her gradually, the way you hear about important things from people who aren't ready to announce them yet. In sideways mentions, small references, a name dropped and then not followed up on. The first time he mentioned her, it was in the context of a neighborhood coffee shop. "This place near the office has good coffee. I go in the morning sometimes. The owner knows me now." And then, almost as an addition, there's usually a woman there who grades papers. She's a teacher. She brought homemade cookies once and left them at the counter for people. I said nothing, filed it away. 3 Sundays later, the teacher from the coffee shop, Claire, she told me about a community board meeting in the neighborhood. I went. It was mostly about a parking dispute, which was not exactly thrilling, but it was... He paused. It was nice. Being a person in a neighborhood, going to a meeting about parking. Being the kind of person who does that. 2 Sundays after that, I had dinner with Claire last week. I waited. "She teaches 4th grade," he said. "Has for 9 years. She grew up in a small town in Ohio. She doesn't know anything about corporate finance, and she doesn't care. She asked me what I actually liked about my work, not what I was good at, what I liked. And I couldn't answer right away, and she just waited. She wasn't impatient. She just waited until I had something real to say." "And did you?" I asked. "Have something real to say?" "Eventually," he said. It took a minute. I thought about Nora, about the careful architecture of that marriage, about how much of it had been two people performing success at each other. I thought about what it meant that Mason was sitting across a dinner table from a woman who didn't know anything about corporate finance and wasn't impressed by what he'd been and was simply waiting for him to say something true. "She sounds like good people," I said. "She is," Mason said, and the simplicity of it, the absence of strategy or performance in those two words, was the most hopeful thing I'd heard from him in years. Nora, I should tell you, landed on her feet. I heard from her twice after the loan signing, once in January, a brief formal call to tell me the divorce proceedings were underway and that she wanted me to know there were no hard feelings toward me personally, which I appreciated for its honesty. The second time was in April, an unexpected call, her voice lighter than I'd ever heard it. "I took a job," she said, "in a different city, marketing director for a nonprofit. It pays a third of what I made before." A pause. "I'm excited about it." "Good," I said, and meant it. "Vivian," her voice shifted. "I've thought a lot about what you said, in your kitchen, about figuring out what my life looks like. Not Mason's life, mine. Have you figured it out?" "I'm figuring it out," she said. "That's different from having it figured out, but I think it might be better." She paused. "I just wanted to say thank you for not treating me like the enemy. I know that would have been easier." "You weren't the enemy," I said. "You were someone who made the same mistake a lot of people make, choosing who to be based on who you were with instead of who you actually were. That's not an enemy, that's just human." She laughed, slightly, small and real. "Yeah," she said. "Yeah, that's pretty much it." We said goodbye. I didn't expect to hear from her again, and that was all right. Some people pass through your life at the exact moment they need to, and then move on. And the moving on isn't a failure of connection. It's just the right shape of things. In May, I established the first of what would eventually become 3 charitable initiatives funded through Leonard's estate. The first was a scholarship fund at the community college across town, full tuition for students returning to education after age 40, specifically because I understood something about the courage that required, and because I had opinions about who deserved a second chance and wanted to do something concrete about those opinions. The second was a partnership with a hospital system to fund palliative care support services, not for patients, but for families of patients, for the people sitting in hospital rooms holding hands, who needed someone to talk to and often had no one, who were disappearing, quietly, in the rooms of the dying, and would emerge months later hollow and lost and with no map for what came after. I knew something about that particular disappearance. The third came later after a conversation with Mason that surprised me. He called one Sunday and said, unprompted, "I've been thinking about what you did with the loan, about the structure of it. There are people who can't start over because there's no one in their corner who'll take the risk on them. Not a bank, not a family member, nobody." He paused. "What would it look like to do that at scale? A fund, maybe, for people trying to rebuild legitimate businesses after financial collapse?" I sat with that for a long moment. "Are you suggesting," I said carefully, "that we build something together?" "I'm suggesting it might be worth thinking about," he said. "You have the resources. I'm starting to have the experience of what the bottom actually looks like. That combination might be useful to people." It was the first time Mason had proposed a collaboration instead of an assumption of control. The first time he'd framed his own knowledge as something that might serve others rather than elevate himself. I noticed that. I noticed it the way you notice a small plant coming up through concrete with a disproportionate amount of feeling because you know what it costs to get there. "Let's think about it," I said. We did. And eventually we built it. But that's slightly ahead of where I am in this telling. Uki. The wedding was in September. Mason and Claire had been together 8 months, which is not long by most measures, but I had stopped measuring Mason's life by most measures. I had started measuring it by the quality of what was in it, and what was in it when he called me on a Tuesday evening in July to say that he'd asked Claire to marry him was something I hadn't heard in his voice since he was young. Not excitement. Excitement is too thin a word. Solidity. A solidity that came not from certainty about the future, but from certainty about the person beside him and the kind of man he was trying to be. "She said yes," he said, slightly stunned sounding. "She actually said yes." "Of course she said yes," I said. Mom, I'm 40 years old and I'm broke and I share an office desk with a 28-year-old who is better at Excel than I will ever be. And she said, Mason. I stopped him. She said yes because of who you are, not what you have. Do you understand that? Do you actually understand what that means? A silence. Yeah, he said quietly. Yeah, I think for the first time in my life, I actually do. The wedding was held at the farmhouse. Mason had asked tentatively whether that would be all right, and I had said yes before he finished the sentence. The garden that I had spent the spring restoring was in full late summer form by September. Not perfect, gardens never are. There were still bare patches where the soil hadn't recovered and one section of fencing that hadn't been repaired in time, but green and real and alive in the way things are when they've been tended by someone who cares about them rather than someone performing the caring. We set up chairs under the oak tree. Leonard's oak tree, older than everyone's problems combined, its leaves just beginning to think about turning at the edges, that early September gold that promises autumn without quite committing. Claire wore a simple dress, cream-colored, that she had bought with her own money and altered herself because she was handy with a needle in the way practical people often are. She looked beautiful in the way that has nothing to do with performance and everything to do with being genuinely, unself-consciously happy in a moment. Mason stood under the oak tree in a suit that was not expensive. He had one good suit left from his previous life and had declined my offer to buy him a new one, which I had respected. And he watched Claire walk toward him across the farmhouse garden with an expression I had not seen on his face in decades. He looked like someone who knew he didn't deserve this and was going to spend the rest of his life trying to be worthy of it anyway. That, I have learned, is the closest any of us gets to deserving anything good. Ruth stood beside me. She had flown in from Portland despite her hip, which she declared worth it. She gripped my arm during the vows, and I gripped hers back, and neither of us said anything, which was the right call. Daniel Reed was there too, sitting in the third row, and when I caught his eye, he nodded at me with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has kept a very important secret for a very long time and is finally watching it fulfill its purpose. After the ceremony, when the small gathering of guests had moved toward the tables in the garden and music was playing from somewhere, something simple, not a band, just a speaker with a thoughtfully made playlist, Mason came to find me. He was holding 2 glasses of something sparkling, and he handed me one, and we stood together at the edge of the garden, away from the noise, under the oak tree's shadow. He looked at his father's photograph, which I had framed and placed on a small table near the ceremony space. I had put it there without asking permission, because I hadn't needed permission. This was my house, this was my decision, and Leonard belonged here as much as any of us. Mason was quiet for a long moment, looking at the photograph. Then he knelt down. Right there, in the grass, in his one good suit, he knelt down in front of his father's photograph. Not performing it for anyone, most of the guests weren't watching. Just a man, kneeling, speaking quietly to a father who wasn't there to hear it. I couldn't make out the words. I wasn't trying to. Some conversations aren't ours to witness, even when we're standing close enough to touch them. He was down there for maybe a minute. Then he stood, straightened his jacket, and turned back to me. His eyes were wet. He didn't wipe them. He just stood there and let them be wet, which for Mason was the bravest thing I'd watched him do. Thank you, he said, for trusting his plan. Thank you, I said, for being worth trusting it for. He nodded, looked out at the garden, at Claire laughing with someone near the tables, at the oak tree, at the house with its repaired windows, and its new paint and its impossible stubborn bones that had outlasted everything. And something settled in his face. Not resolution, exactly. Not the end of something. More like the solid click of a thing finally sitting correctly in its place. He was right, Mason said. About all of it. He usually was, I said. It was very annoying. Mason laughed. The real one. The one I hadn't heard in 15 years, unguarded and sudden and completely his. The one from when he was 7 years old in the branches of this exact tree. There it was. There it was. Yep. I am going to tell you the last thing now because it is the part that matters most, and I have been carrying it the longest. 8 months after the wedding, Mason came to the farmhouse on a Sunday afternoon. He brought Claire, who was by then visibly pregnant. They were expecting a girl, due in April, a fact that had rearranged something fundamental in my chest the first time they told me. He also brought something I wasn't expecting, a check and a manila envelope. He sat at the kitchen table, Leonard's kitchen table, the same table where I had read the letter the night everything changed, and he put both on the table in front of me. The check was the loan repayment. All $50,000, plus the interest we had agreed on, paid 18 months ahead of the schedule Daniel had drawn up. I looked at it for a moment. "Mason, I want to pay it back properly," he said. "I know you didn't need the money. That's not the point. The point is that I borrowed it, and I said I'd repay it, and I'm repaying it." A pause. "That matters to me." I picked up the check, folded it once, set it aside. "What's in the envelope?" I asked. He glanced at Claire briefly. Something passed between them. A private communication. Two people who have learned each other's language. "It's a proposal," he said, "for the Second Chance Fund. I've spent 4 months putting it together. Legal structure, funding model, intake criteria, oversight framework." He pushed the envelope toward me. I didn't want to just talk about it. I wanted to show up with something real. I opened the envelope. Inside was 47 pages, carefully organized, thorough in a way that spoke to months of serious thought. I didn't read it all then. I read enough. Enough to see that my son had taken the experience of his own destruction and turned it into something that might prevent someone else's, or at least make the rebuilding less impossible. I set the pages down. Across the table, Mason sat with his hands flat on the wood, in the particular posture of a man who has put something real and vulnerable in front of someone whose opinion matters to him and is now waiting. Claire had her hand over his, lightly, not protective exactly, but present. A partner, not a handler. "You know," I said, "that when we do this, it has to be done right, with accountability, with oversight. You can't run it like a passion project." "I know that," he said, "and there will be people it doesn't work for. People who take the money and don't change. You have to be prepared for that. I know that too." He paused. "It happened to me, in a way. The first version of me that got a second chance, but that was in my 20s when Dad bailed me out of that investment that went wrong, and I learned nothing from it. Nothing. I just walked away thinking I'd gotten lucky." He looked at the table. The difference this time was that I had no cushion, no one to call. I had to sit in the actual consequence until it changed me. Not everyone needs that specific thing, but nobody changes without hitting something real first. I looked at my son, 41 years old, sitting at his grandmother's kitchen table, Leonard's kitchen table, in a restored farmhouse, next to a woman who loved him for the right reasons, with a daughter coming in April, with a proposal in 47 pages, and a repaid debt and the specific quiet dignity of a man who had learned the hardest lesson available and survived it. He was not perfect. He would never be perfect. He still had a temper he managed imperfectly sometimes. He still had moments of arrogance that surfaced in the wrong contexts, and that Claire, I gathered, had no patience for and said so clearly. He was still learning how to be in a family without trying to run it. These things were true. But he was here, present, trying, building something from the ground up for the second time in his life, and this time building it from the right materials. Leonard would have been proud. Not in the way fathers say they're proud at graduations and promotions, the reflexive public pride that doesn't mean very much. In the deeper way, in the way that requires actually seeing someone, knowing them, and watching them become, with tremendous difficulty and real cost, more than they were. "Okay," I said, "let's build it." Tom. We named the fund the Cole Initiative, which was Mason's idea, and which I agreed to after a long conversation about whether it was the right thing to name something after a family that had spent the preceding year being publicly dismantled. Mason argued that the name wasn't about legacy or reputation, it was about accountability. That if something went wrong, our name was on it, and that mattered. That you put your name on the things you were willing to stand behind. I thought about Leonard and the quiet 14 months he had spent building something with my name on it. I agreed. The first year, the Cole Initiative funded 11 people, small businesses, fresh starts, people who had lost everything to circumstances that ranged from bad luck to bad decisions and deserved the chance to try again with support. Not charity. Structure. Mentorship. Accountability. The same conditions I had given Mason, scaled and formalized. Not all 11 made it. 2 walked away from their plans. 1 returned the money. But 8 of them, by the end of that first year, were standing, making payroll, paying it back, slowly, in the amounts they could manage. 8 people standing who hadn't been standing before. Leonard would have said that was a start. He would have been right. On a Sunday evening in late October, 2 years after the will reading, I sat on the farmhouse porch as the light went down. The garden was preparing for winter again. The second winter I'd watched it do this from this porch. Some of the plantings I'd put in during spring were showing themselves now in the structure they'd built underground, the parts you couldn't see yet, but that would come back. That's how perennials work. You plant them, and they disappear. And you have to trust that what you did was enough, that something is happening beneath the surface even when you can't see it. Ruth had called that afternoon. Mason had called in the morning from somewhere that sounded like a park. His daughter was 5 weeks old, small enough to be terrifying, and he'd gone out while Claire slept because the baby liked motion. And he'd been walking circles around a park, describing to me, with the specific wonder of a first-time parent who had not expected to be transformed by the experience, the precise shape of his daughter's fist when she gripped his finger. She just grabbed it, he said, still slightly stunned. Like she meant it. Like it was specifically my finger she wanted. It was, I said. How do you know that? Because I was there when you were that size, I said. And yours was specifically my finger, too. A silence, then quietly, what did you name me in those early days? Before I became whatever I became. I thought about it. Leo, I said, when it was just us. I called you Leo. After your father's middle name, you looked like him those first weeks, before you grew into my jaw. He was quiet for a long moment. Leo, he said, like he was trying it on, like it was something retrieved from a place he'd stopped looking. Yes, I said. Leo. We stayed on the phone a while after that, not saying much, just existing in the same call while his daughter slept against his chest in a park somewhere, and I sat in my kitchen in the farmhouse with the afternoon light coming through the window I'd had repaired in January, and outside the oak tree stood in the yard doing what it had been doing for longer than any of us could imagine. Standing, enduring, being older than everyone's problems combined. Now, on the porch in October, I sat with a cup of tea and watched the sky go from gold to orange to the specific bruised purple of a clear evening before full dark. The kind of sky Leonard used to stop what he was doing to look at. He said a sky like that was the world being honest about something. I thought about everything. About the woman who had walked into that law office in an unwashed black dress, expecting nothing, getting the farmhouse, getting a letter, getting a key. About the woman who had sat on the floor by a dead man's boots and cried until she was empty and then gotten up and kept going. About what it had cost and what it had built and what had been broken and whether the breaking was worth what grew from it. There is no clean answer to that question. I want you to know that. Anyone who tells you there is a clean answer is not telling you the truth. What Leonard did was an act of love that was also, unquestionably, an act of control. What I did by trusting the plan was brave, and was also, in honest moments, a failure of intervention I'm still not entirely at peace with. What Mason lost needed to be lost, and the losing was still terrible, and both of those things are true simultaneously, and neither cancels the other. That's what I've learned, maybe. More than anything else. That the true things are almost always the complicated ones. That love is not simple. That family is not simple. That the people who hurt you and the people who save you are sometimes the same people at different points in the same story. That forgiveness is not a feeling. It's a practice, repeated, imperfect, chosen again every time the old wound announces itself. That money is not nothing, but it is very close to the last thing that matters. That real wealth, the kind that doesn't fit in a safe, the kind that can't be inherited or stolen or lost in a lawsuit, is built out of the things that are hardest to keep. Honesty, humility, the willingness to be changed by your failures, and love that is stubborn enough to survive the versions of people they are before they become who they needed to be. Leonard knew that. He always knew it. He'd been trying to teach it his whole life, And at the end, when he had nothing left but time and the love of a man who refuses to give up on his family, he designed one final lesson: enormous, painful, imperfect, and true. The sky went fully dark. The oak tree disappeared into it, its shape only visible against the stars. I finished my tea. I thought, there she is, Vivian. There she is. And I went inside, into the warm and imperfect and fully mine house, and I closed the door behind me.